Good afternoon. If you could please find your seats. My name is John Nusper, professor of political science here at St. Louis Community College. For those of you that were here this morning, you know that it was a great morning, great speakers, and I look forward to a great afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Kearn Schemm, Jr., lawyer, U.S. diplomat, human rights activist, and vice president of the German World Alliance. Dr. Schemm will speak about the international conflict with German culture. Beginning in 1914, attacks against ethnic Germans in the United States started with small changes, from ending publication of German language newspapers to eliminating the requirement of German language courses in school. The small changes turned into larger changes, which will be brought to our attention through Dr. Schemm's lecture. Dr. Schemm. Thank you very much.
My topic today is the war against German culture. It's a topic that probably impacts many of you, given the fact that Missouri was settled to a large extent by Germans. In fact, according to Professor Don Toltzman, Missouri is almost 40% of German descent today. Can I have a show of hands of how many of you in the audience are of German descent? It's a bit more than 40% of this group. The topic impacts me since I'm a third-generation American of half Germanic ancestry. The other half's Irish. I was born in Newark, New Jersey, in a hospital founded as the Newark German Hospital, and now known as Clara Moss Hospital after its most famous nurse who gave her life trying to help Walter Reed find a cure for yellow fever. The reason that the hospital is no longer named Newark German is the war against German culture and language, which continues to this very day. Things German, however, were not always negatively stereotyped. Let me ask you a few questions, and let's see who knows the answers regarding some positive aspects of German culture. When was the first anti-slavery protest drafted? And what language was it in? Who can answer that one? Okay, Hans?
Okay, it was German that came to the United States first. Okay.
Okay. I'll give you the rest. It may surprise you that the first time anybody protested against the institution of slavery in the or what became the United States, was in the year 1688, a German language protest against slavery in Germantown, Pennsylvania. Second question, who founded the first public library in New York? You might hear I come from that area. I'll answer it for you. Germans. Who founded the first legal aid society in the United States? You got it! You're pretty good. Okay. It was founded as the Deutsche Rechtsschutzverein, German Legal Aid Society, and it was incorporated in New York City in 1876. Now, the term German today has many implications to many people. I'd like to take a moment now to have a few of you give me your thoughts when you hear the word German. Please don't be shy. We need to know how your ideas have been molded. Let's make a column of positive stereotypes and of negative ones. Okay, who's got a positive stereotype of Germans? Who's got one? Somebody's got to have a positive one. Okay, the man with the hat. Precise. I don't know how to spell that. Precise. I think that's precise. What? Hardworking. I don't know. Organized. One more.
Dependable.
Beer drinkers? Okay, that's positive? I don't know. My grandmother didn't think much of that with my grandfather, but beer drinkers, okay. Okay, I'll do one more, dependable. Well, you guys are ruining my speech. Okay, now let's go, unfortunately, to the other side. What about the negative stereotypes that we hear every day about Germans in the United States? And I'm going to tell you, every place else in the world, including Germany and Austria. Nazi, the N-word. First one. Okay, what about militarist? Obey. Warmongers. How about barbarians? Well, that's a bad name for them. Okay, you can see, in this crowd at least, there's a few, maybe even a majority of positive stereotypes, but we still come up with a whole bunch of negative stereotypes which we hear every single day of our lives and which impact us. The negative stereotypes were not always so. While many think of Germans as militaristic or well-organized, Leo Tolstoy, in War and Peace, gave a very different opinion of the martial qualities of the Germans. And I quote Leo Tolstoy, "Awareness of disorder became a general conviction, but now ascribing the cause of the disorder with particular pleasure to the muddle-headed Germans, everyone became convinced that the harmful confusion taking place was the doing of the sausage eaters." That's Leo Tolstoy's opinion of the martial abilities of the Germans in 1878 or so when he wrote War and Peace. It was socially acceptable to be a German and be proud of it. Queen Victoria, you heard of her? Spoke only German until she was 3. Her son, Edward VII, spoke English his whole life long with a German accent. Queen Victoria once declared, "The German element is one I wish to be cherished and kept up in our beloved home." She even went so far as to tell her cousin, King Leopold of Belgium, that "my heart is so German." The Queen was not alone in her feelings. On the eve of the First World War, a group of eminent British intellectuals published a remarkable open letter. It lauded Germany as a highly civilized country with a culture that has contributed greatly to Western civilization, racially allied to ourselves and with moral ideas largely resembling our own. 2 days before German troops invaded Belgium, the letter called for British neutrality, arguing that the war against Germany would be a crime against civilization. While the First World War was what started the hardcore war against German culture and language, there had been rumblings before the U.S. entry into the war. And the person who voiced these rumblings in the U.S. loudest was Theodore Roosevelt, who said on Columbus Day 1915, before the U.S. entered World War I, "There is no room in this country for hyphenated Americanism. A hyphenated American is not an American at all. The one absolutely certain way of bringing this nation to ruin, of preventing all possibility of becoming a nation at all, will be to permit it to become a tangle of squabbling nationalities, an intricate knot of German Americans, Irish Americans. There's no such thing as a hyphenated American who is a good American. The only man who is a good American is a man who is American and nothing else. Roosevelt implied in these remarks that the Germans and Irish, in particular, had some sort of extraterritorial loyalty. He and his whole class, however, had no difficulty in identifying with and showing loyalty for the war aims of Great Britain. Perhaps the seminal moment in the war against German culture was August 5th, 1914, when the British cut the transatlantic cables from Germany to the U.S. The purpose of this act was to prevent the German side from being heard in the American press, to prevent articles showing the German war effort in a positive way from reaching the American public. All European news was now filtered through British censors. Only German news dispatches brought in by ship or submarine ever reached the American press. The English language press ignored these as German propaganda. Incidentally, another question for you. What language was the largest number of newspapers in the United States printed in 1914? There were more German language newspapers in the United States in 1914 than there were English. Good reason, because the average educational level and literacy of the German American population was higher than that of the Anglo-American population, many of whom were rural farmers. So World War I progressed with only British propaganda being available to the American people. Germans went from being Saxon brothers to being Asiatic Huns overnight. Lies were told about rape and child murders committed by German soldiers in Belgium, about German plants that turned corpses of murdered Belgians into soap and other products for German use. Germans in Canada were terrorized. The town of Berlin was forced to change its name to Kitchener, still is called Kitchener to this day. A concentration camp was set up on the Isle of Man, which held over 100,000 German British civilians, including relatives of mine. Incidentally, when was the first concentration camp invented and by whom? One of the students in the back, maybe. Do you know where the first concentration camp was? In South Africa by the English to break the will of the Boers. Second use on a large scale of concentration camps was the Isle of Man. Every German, every Austrian on the British islands was incarcerated on the Isle of Man for the duration of the First World War. Although they controlled most news from Europe, the British could not control the flood of news that resulted from the armed rebellion in Ireland during Easter week 1916. The brutality with which the British put down the rebellion horrified Irish Americans and many Anglo-Americans as well, and came close to causing the U.S. To enter World War I on the side of Germany. The execution of the leaders of the rebellion, seen by many Americans as the founding fathers of a free Ireland, further burdened U.S. relations with the British Empire. It is interesting to note that there were no rebellions in the German Empire during World War I or in the Austrian Empire. Its citizens of whatever ethnicity supported the country which had granted universal adult male suffrage before Great Britain and had had the first social security insurance system in the world. They had reason to support the government. But aside from the eye-opening caused by the Easter Rising, Britain and France continued to control the flow of news, and American sympathies slowly were molded in their behalf. Since the British and French navies controlled the seas, trade with Germany dried up, and huge arms sales were made to the Western Allies, giving an economic reason for pro-Allied sympathies. Stockpiles of weapons and ammunition piled up on Black Tom Island in New York Bay. On the night of July 30th, 1916, 2 million pounds of ammunition, which were being stored in a depot and freight cars for transportation to Great Britain and France to kill German soldiers, were blown up by German-American agents. This soured relationships with Germany, obviously, because it was a tremendous, tremendous economic loss to the companies that had produced the ammunition and TNT. Germany declared unlimited submarine warfare against all ships heading for Allied ports. American ships, however, continued to travel to these ports. In the most famous case, German intelligence officers were informed by Irish and German-American dock workers that the Lusitania was carrying war materials destined for Allied armies. Indeed, her manifest stated that her cargo included an estimated 4,200,000 rounds of rifle cartridges. The German embassy did what it could, warning American citizens and other neutrals not to travel on the Lusitania. When the Lusitania was sunk off the coast of Ireland, where a first explosion caused by a German torpedo did not sink the ship, but a second explosion, believed by many to have been caused by the ammunition on board, caused the ship to sink with great loss of life. As we know, the U.S. entered World War I against Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1917. As a result of American resources and our fresh troops, the tide of battle turned against Germany, and the war ended with Allied victory. To ensure agreement to any terms the Allies wanted, the blockade of food on Germany and against Austria as well was continued. And as Dr. Vesselis pointed out earlier, people actually dropped dead walking on the streets in Vienna as a result of the extreme lack of caloric intake that they had. To this day, you can see old people that were born during this period with terrible back problems because they did not receive the required calcium that they needed. This was to enforce German willingness to accept any terms. The impact of World War I on German Americans was huge. The KKK became actively anti-German, burning crosses on the lawns of many German Americans. German newspapers were closed. Speaking German in public or educating your children in German language schools became illegal. Many were tarred and feathered for alleged disloyalty to the United States. Robert Prager, a socialist German immigrant living in the area of St. Louis, was lynched in Collinsville, Illinois. Do you know where Collinsville, Illinois is? After an anti-German mob gained entrance to a jail where he was being held and found Prager hiding in the basement, the police stood aside as the mob marched him to beyond city limits. After allowing Prager to write a brief letter to his parents in Germany and pray, he was hanged in front of a crowd of 200 people. The Collinsville Herald editor and publisher, J.O. Monroe, said that, and I quote, "Outside a few persons who may still honor a harbor Germanic inclinations, the whole city is glad that the 11 men indicted for hanging Prager were acquitted." Monroe noted, "The community is well convinced that he was disloyal. The city does not miss him. The lesson of his death has had a wholesome effect on the Germanists of Collinsville and the rest of the nation." He praised the lynching of a man who had never been convicted of anything. German-American author Kurt Vonnegut described the losses suffered by German Americans. The anti-German feeling so shamed Kurt's parents' generation, he noted, that they resolved to raise his generation without acquainting me with the language or the literature or the music or the oral family histories which my ancestors had loved. They volunteered to make me ignorant and ruthless as proof of their patriotism. As he put it, he lost Europe, and so did most German Americans of his generation. The post-World War I peace, which was supposed to ensure no territorial changes without the expressed desire of the populations involved, and which was the promise which led Germany to surrender, was not based on self-determination at all. Alsace-Lorraine, where 95% of this population of over 2 million spoke German as their mother language, was given to France without a plebiscite. The Sudetenland was granted to the newly created Czechoslovak state, giving 3.5 million German speakers to the new state, persons who had no desire to belong to Czechoslovakia. On March 4th, 1919, Sudeten Germans peacefully demonstrated in favor of remaining part of Austria. On Czech government orders, Czech military shot at the unarmed demonstrators. The crashing of hand grenades, accompanied by the salvos of gunfire and screams of those mortally wounded. 54 dead and hundreds of injured remained lying in the streets. Among the places where this happened were Arnau, Aussig, Eger, Kaden, Mies, Karlsbad, Sternberg, and Freudenthal. The 54 dead included 20 women and girls, an 80-year-old man, big threat to the Czech state, one youth of 16, one of 13, and one only 11 years old. This bloody event that ought to have shaken the world to its foundations remained without any publication in the West, or virtually no publication in the West. And to this day, if you look it up on an English language Wikipedia or something like that, you basically don't find anything about the massacre. Poland, which had not existed for more than 100 years, was rightfully resurrected after World War I. But her borders were drawn in a way to cause the new state to have permanent problems with Germany. In areas of mixed population, plebiscites were to be held, which was at least better than the situation in Alsace or in the Sudetenland. But the rules of the plebiscites were strange. If Poland received 51% of an area, of the votes in an area, the entire area was ceded to Poland. If Germany received even up to 99% of the votes in an area, the 1% that voted for Poland was sliced off and given to Poland. This led to some 2 million Germans becoming what have been referred to as orphans of Versailles and becoming Polish citizens against their will. The city of Danzig, about 95% German, was made into a free city, although no one there wanted to be free. They wanted to be part of Germany. The period of the Weimar Republic saw Germany stripped of its ability to defend itself and subject to the whims of her neighbors. Austria, whose first act as a democracy was to declare itself to be an integral part of Germany under the name of Deutsche Österreich, was forced to change its name to simply Austria and forbidden from unifying with Germany. German-speaking West Hungary was only allowed to join Austria in 1921 after a very corrupt referendum, which, due to voting irregularities, led to Ödenburg, today known as Sopron, and Pressburg, today known as Bratislava, being given to Hungary and Czechoslovakia, respectively. South Tyrol was given to Italy without a plebiscite. All this was done with the intent to decrease the number of Germans. In the words of Georges Clemenceau, there are 20 million Germans too many. He wanted to cut down that number, and he certainly did his part. The post-World War I period saw intense Frankification in Alsace, repression of the German minority in Poland, which led to about 1 million ethnic Germans, 1/2 of the total ethnic German population, to emigrate from Poland between 1918 and 1938, and hundreds of complaints being filed with the League of Nations. The same was true of Czechoslovakia, where Germans were subjected to arbitrary rules. Minority laws, passed to protect the Germans, Hungarians, and Poles, were applied in such a way as to discriminate against them. Discontent grew in all the areas which had been torn from Germany. In 1938, Lord Runciman, a British nobleman charged with reporting on conditions in Czechoslovakia, wrote, "It is a hard thing to be ruled by an alien race. And I have been left with the impression that the Czechoslovak rule in the Sudeten area for the last 20 years, though not actually oppressive and certainly not terroristic, has been marked by tactlessness, lack of understanding, petty intolerance, and discrimination to the point where the resentment of the German population was inevitably moving in the direction of revolt. Based on his recommendations, the Sudetenland was unified with Greater Germany in 1938. World War II started over German-speaking sections of Poland. Hitler, after his bloodless incorporation of Austria and the Sudetenland, felt that he could pull the same thing off with Western Poland. He miscalculated and World War II began. Although his attack on Poland cannot be justified, we should not forget that in the first days of the war, some 5,000 ethnic Germans were massacred by the Poles, and that these massacres were later used by the Nazis as justification for their own brutal treatment of Polish civilians. The war against the Hitlerian Reich was justified on many levels. However, what once again became a war on German culture during and after the war was not. Germans were once again interned in large numbers in Britain, Canada, Australia, and many countries allied with Britain. In the United States, starting in 1938, 3 years before we entered the war, the FBI developed a list of German Americans it considered suspicious. It did the same with Germans in South American countries. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but before Germany and the U.S. were at war, German Americans were picked up and interned. Eventually, as many as 30,000 may have been interned in U.S. camps, and some camps that housed the same camps that housed 120,000 Japanese Americans. Several thousand German Latin Americans were kidnapped from their home countries, and brought to the U.S. for internment as well. The U.S. State Department encouraged their home countries to arrest them, seize their assets, and deport them to the U.S. Upon arrival in the U.S., they were charged with illegally entering the U.S. also. That's a good trick. You force somebody to come and charge them with illegal entry. Brazil set up its own internment camps in which some 15,000 German Brazilian leaders were incarcerated for the duration of the war. Some of these people, their families had been in Brazil since 1815. After the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union, the entire ethnic German population of European Russia, millions of people, were deported in cattle cars to the Soviet Far East. Hundreds of thousands of these Germans died in the transports. This, although ethnic Germans were accounting themselves well in the defense of the Soviet Union. Indeed, one of the heroes of the defense of Brest was an ethnic German by the name of Wagner. To this day, and I want to stress that, till 2010, the descendants of these deported ethnic Germans have not received an apology for their treatment at the hands of Soviet authorities. To this day, they are forbidden from returning to their home regions, although all other ethnic so-called enemies of the state have long since been allowed to return to their homes. The bombing terror of German cities during the war took tremendous toll. I can't begin to give you an accurate figure of the dead, since it has been deliberately falsified and revised downward since the end of the war. One example should suffice: Dresden. Curiously, before Dresden was attacked, I believe it's a week before Dresden was attacked, Winston Churchill, kind of echoing the comment of Clemenceau, said, "There are 1 million Germans, still too many." February 1945, after the bombing over Valentine's Day, estimated that close to 250,000 people, mostly refugees from the East, had met their end there. And the estimation was based on counts of bodies and ashes and remains. Today, under American and British pressure, the city now claims that a figure of between 18,000 and 25,000 were killed there, only 1/10 of what the German government actually counted in 1945. Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite authors, was a POW in Dresden and lived through the firestorm there. He spoke of hundreds of thousands of dead. As Soviet troops moved towards the west and conquered German territory, they treated the civilian population with unheard-of brutality. In the villages of Gumbinen and Nemmersdorf in East Prussia, whole populations were wiped out. These atrocities led to the two largest maritime catastrophes in human history. as German civilians ran in terror of the Soviet army and sought to get across the Baltic Sea to Denmark and the rest of Germany. These were of the losses of the ships Wilhelm Gustloff and the General von Steuben. Both were refugee ships torpedoed by Soviet submarines. On both ships, between 7,000 and 10,000 people, mostly women and children, died. Between 14,000 and 20,000 people. Have you ever heard of either of these ships? I'm asking the students back there. Have you ever heard of the Wilhelm Gustloff or the General von Steuben? You haven't, because American press doesn't report about losses of Germans. By the time the war ended, several million women had been raped by Soviet soldiers who should have been their liberators. Virtually every woman in Berlin and Vienna, and many women in smaller German towns. In the West, it was better, but there were far too many incidents of rape by French colonial troops and even American troops. The use of rape against German women was the largest application of rape as the weapon of war in human history. Once again, how many of you have heard about that? How many of you have heard about the mass rapes of German women by Soviet officers, soldiers? The older generation of people who were impacted by it. I doubt the students have, because it's not taught. Perhaps the greatest of all these atrocities was the treatment of German prisoners of war. The Soviets held many until 1956, 11 years after the war had ended, and hundreds of thousands died at their hands. The Yugoslavs buried 3,000 alive in a seaside bunker that they walled up. The huge U.S. POW camps in the Rheinwiesen, or Rhine Meadows camps, in which there were no shelter, not enough food, and local people were forbidden from giving food to the captives on fear of being shot. Estimates of German POW losses in U.S. and French camps range up to 800,000. These are estimates of a fairly neutral French-Canadian author, James Bach, who Professor Wessler also mentioned. Once the Nazis were defeated, the Polish, Yugoslav, and Czechoslovak authorities had their chance to do what they viewed as even the slate. Poland and Yugoslavia set up numerous concentration camps for ethnic German citizens. In some of these camps, infant mortality was 100%. In Poland, 60 to 80,000 Germans died in these camps. These were people who were citizens of Poland before 1940, before the invasion. After the war ended, Polish authorities now admit that close to 99% of the people incarcerated and who died were innocent of any crime against Poland or the Polish people. In Czechoslovakia, many of the Nazi concentration camps were kept in use, but now for Germans rather than Jews. The most famous of which was Theresienstadt, which saw service until 1946. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rudy, I believe it's 46. All Germans were forced to wear armbands with an N for Nemets, which is the Czechoslovak for German, on them. They were subjected to much the same legal discriminations that Jews suffered under the Nazis. They weren't allowed to full rations, they were not allowed to use public transportation, were not allowed to go films, etc., etc., etc. There were many massacres of unbelievable brutality. In all, about 240,000 Sudeten Germans were killed or died during this period. The Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Yugoslavs, Romanians, and Soviets were given the right to expel all or part of their ethnic German populations. Only the Romanians made very little use of this right. About 1/7 of the ethnic Germans from Yugoslavia perished. Virtually all the ethnic Germans from Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia lost their homes and were never paid any compensation for their losses. Once again, to this day, not a penny. Add to this the Germans from Germany proper, east of the Oder-Neisse line, and you have the largest act of ethnic cleansing in world history. with a total of some 15 million, some say 16 million, expelled from their homes, of whom 2.5 million lost their lives. You have to imagine this. 1/3 of the area inhabited by Germans was emptied of its inhabitants. 1/3. Are you familiar with these facts? Have you even heard about the camps for Germans, the expulsion, the 2.5 million dead? Please show me your hands if you have. Particularly, I'm interested in the students. If any of you heard about this, the students don't raise their hands. They haven't. Very few Americans know about these events because our press was silent at the time and continues to be silent to this day. Today, the war against German culture and language remains in effect. Little is written about what is positive about Germany or the Germans, whether in Germany, Switzerland, Alsace, Austria, or elsewhere. We're exposed to a non-stop torrent of abuse of the good name of the Germans. Jokes are made about German peacekeepers. How could there be such a thing, a German peacekeeper? In the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Serbia, Croatia, discriminatory anti-German laws known as the Beneš decrees and Avnoj decrees are still in effect to this day. Germans are excluded from getting their properties back by law, although Jews and others can get their property back. Even provably anti-Nazi Germans who attempted to reclaim their properties are prevented from so doing by the decrees. In Poland, the German minority continues to live in such fear that they are afraid to ask for rights granted them in present-day democratic Poland. The same applies to the Czech Republic, where the inhabitants of the few German villages that remain are so terrified that they do not even request bilingual signs for their villages. In Alsace, I have seen a group of 10 Alsatians speaking German amongst themselves immediately switch to French when a police officer draws within earshot. So cowed they are. And in the United States, German Americans interned during World War II in the same camps as Japanese Americans continue to be denied the recognition and, in my opinion, restitution granted to the Japanese over 20 years ago. I want to thank Rudy Pischel for his discussion of the intellectual re-education and intellectual ethnic cleansing of Germany. I don't want to add on to that at this point in time. Yes, my name is Kearn Schemm, and I'm a German American. I am also a person who believes in standing up for the weaker guy, the guy everyone picks on. The Germans are the weaker guy who have been so cowed, so frightened by the 90-year war against the Germans that they are terrified to open their mouths and state the basic fact. We are people too. Our pain counts too. Wrongs done to us need to be remedied too. I'm open to questions now. Thank you. Mr. Kopp.
Yes, would you enlighten the audience about the German contribution during the colonial and the Civil War in numbers?
Well, numbers I don't know I can do. In the colonial period, there were roughly 10% Germans. Even then, there was a large number of Germans in the United States, primarily in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey. But even John Adams's butler was of German descent, so they were even up into New England. Savannah, was it Savannah? I think it was Savannah, Georgia, was founded by Germans. And of course, General von Steuben created the discipline of the U.S. Colonial troops. The Battle of, I'm trying to remember, a crucial battle of, I believe it was Saratoga, was won primarily by Hudson Valley German troops against the British. And the population, German-American population, was overwhelmingly pro-independence. Civil War, Germans in St. Louis prevented Missouri from seceding from the Union. Germans in Baltimore prevented Maryland from seceding from the Union. There was a mini civil war in southern Texas where Germans fighting for the Union attempted to get Texas back into the Union. So you can see the Germans were thoroughly American in the sense of being pro-Union. There was an entire brigade, what was his name? Can't remember the name of the... in the Civil War, Schurz, Siegel and Schurz both had brigades, German-American brigades, which unfortunately, once again, to go back to Leo Tolstoy, they were not really effective military units. They were looked upon pretty much as pathetic wooden-shoed Germans who weren't very good fighters. But they tried to do their part. So that's the best I can do. I can't tell you the percentages of American soldiers. I know that Art Jacobs uses the figure of 3 million German Americans fighting in World War II. Professor Wessela?
Well, you mentioned the unfortunate gentleman who was hanged in Collingwood.
I didn't catch that.
You mentioned the unfortunate gentleman who was hanged in Collingwood, Illinois.
Yes?
But of course, there were a large-scale mob action, not just mob action, but it was ordered by Woodrow Wilson through the Patriot Committee.
Yes?
Especially in Wisconsin, which even today is 54% of its population is of German descent. And in 1917, they burned the books of Kant, Hegel, of all the greatest philosophers in the last 2,000 years. They burned the note sheets of the greatest.
It's very interesting that you raised the book burning issue because precisely the Anglo-American elite that found it so offensive that the Nazis burned books in the 30s, which no doubt it was offensive. I love books and I can't imagine burning one, but they didn't think anything was wrong with it when Anglo-Americans were burning German books.
That's right. And not only that, they removed the Goethe statue in front of the main library in Milwaukee.
Oh, there's many, many statues. Many streets were changed. Many towns were changed. The ethnic cleansing of names during the First and even Second World War in the United States was enormous, but it certainly does not compare with what was done in Eastern Europe after the expulsion. Yes, Wille? I mentioned the French colonial troops, but yeah, but it was the French continued, or the French colonial troops continued. I know I've read about the famous stadium. It was some sort of a Sportstadium where they raped 3,000 women or so all at once, gang raped them. What was done to break the so-called, what the Allies referred to as the racial pride of the Germans in the form of rape, is unspeakable. And it's a crime that to this day is yet to go to be punished.
I just want to make a comment. I'm a professor at a local university.
Fantastic. Start teaching this.
I'm ahead of you.
Okay.
And I teach history. And every semester for at least the past 10 years, in each and every one of my classes, I take 1 or 2 class periods and I teach them history. And of course, they've never heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
One of my students went to one of my colleagues, who's a professor, and he told them about what he had heard. And the history department's response was, it never happened.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
So, being nice and collegial as I am, I wrote back to everyone in the history department, told them the kind of research I was doing without getting into their head, and just asking them some nice collegial questions. Should I start with Versailles? Should I go back to 1870?
I can't see it.
The genocide of the ethnic Germans.
Okay, fantastic, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They never denied it.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that every semester, over 100 students every semester now know about it.
You're a multiplier. You're a multiplier. Thank you.
I'm not going to stop.
Don't stop. Yes.
You mentioned how little is known about those atrocities against German civilians.
Yes.
In Poland, there has been very little thought. In fact, there's not a single sentence in the Polish textbooks for students about the expulsions of the Germans.
This is a
Generations and generations. When my family has been traveling there, they will go to villages where they live, and people don't know anything. They don't know that there were Germans who built those houses.
Well, some of that is disingenuous, I suspect, but I mean, you've got to understand young people who were born after the fact, why would they know? To them, it's home. But what is important is that somehow we break this wall of silence, somehow, and it's up to us, because we obviously don't have friends in high places. It's up to us to make people listen, to make people hear.
May I ask one more question?
I don't know. Maishi? I see Ann standing here ready to put the hook around my neck. Yeah. What's that?
She has one more question. To ask the question.
Is it okay? Yeah.
Yes. There were about a dozen of my family members who went missing, and about half a dozen I know that they were killed. And from my grandfather, I have eyewitnesses that he was killed without any trial or
By Russians or Pol?
Poles.
Mm-hmm.
And I only found out 10 years ago that this happened by those eyewitnesses whom I know personally.
Mm-hmm.
For 10 years, I've been asking questions to all the different places in Poland, all the way up to Cardinal Blank, and nobody will help me to figure out the details, to do research, and establish what happened to my grandfather personally, but there's supposed to be at least an unknown number of German citizens that lived in that town that were all killed the same way, taken to the woods. The woods is there.
This was in the area that became Poland, or was Poland before 38?
In the so-called Wartegau.
Oh, so
Wartegau had a German minority that had lived there for generations and generations. And they were expelled or they fled towards the end of the war, but many did not.
yeah, sure.
And those that did not flee suffered
Well, the sad thing is that the ones who didn't flee were precisely the ones who had never done anything wrong, and they felt, I've done nothing wrong, why should I run away? These people are my neighbors.
If you could take Mr.
They were
Flotz's
wrong.
question.
Mr.
Mr. Flotz. George Flotz.
Mr. Flotz, 1 second, one more question, then I'll leave you be.
I don't have a question, but I'm a survivor of Dresden. And when we talk about 200,000 people dying, the reason we weren't accounted for, because like the book says, you mentioned that we are all blowtorched in the bunkers and on piles in the middle of the streets. So this way they disappear. But this is my statement, I'm a survivor.
You saw it.
And I'm quite sure it's over 200,000. Thank you.
Well, I agree with you. Yep.